Hi everybody, Curtis Mitch here from the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and welcome back to another weekday reflection on today's Mass readings. Today is Monday, May 17th, and our reading today comes from John chapter 16, verses 29 to 33. Now, today's gospel is part of Jesus' Last Supper discourse. He is in the upper room. He's with the disciples, and it's just hours before he's about to be arrested, and his passion will begin in earnest. Now, if you read John in light of the Synoptic Gospels, you'll notice certain differences. You will notice that the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they really tend to focus on what Jesus did at the Last Supper, right? The actions that he took. For instance, Jesus instituted the Eucharist at the Last Supper. Jesus instituted the new priesthood of the new covenant at the Last Supper. But when you turn to the Gospel of John, you don't have quite as much attention given to the actions or doings of Jesus. In fact, you get more attention from John to what Jesus said. And so for John 13 and 14 and 15 and 16 and even into 17, it's almost entirely the words of Jesus. It's what Jesus was saying, and then in John 17, what Jesus was praying. Now, it's interesting that in this section that we have today, we have the very end, the final words of this long upper room discourse that Jesus delivers to his disciples. And these are the last words that Jesus will say before his passion actually begins. This is the last time that he will speak to them as a group before Easter Sunday comes around. So let's look at the passage here. Let's just read through it, and then let's try and figure out some of what Jesus is trying to tell us today. So this is John 16, beginning in verse 29. The disciples said to Jesus, now you are speaking plainly, not in any figure. Now we know that you know all things and need none to question you. By this we believe that you came from God. Jesus answered them, do you now believe? The hour is coming, indeed it has come, when you will be scattered, every man to his home, and will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. I have said this to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. Now, what's going on here? We're sort of catching Jesus mid-sentence here, right at the very end of this discourse. And so his disciples, the very first verse tells us that they said, now you are speaking plainly, not in any figure. Okay, so the disciples begin in today's reading with this sort of eureka moment. They have a little breakthrough. Jesus was speaking to them parabolically, speaking to them in a very mysterious and almost cryptic way about how he will, in a little while, he will leave them, but in a little while further, he will return to them. And they're wondering, what is he talking about? Is he going to the Father right now? And is he then coming back? And then Jesus uses a metaphor, a parable of sorts, to explain what's about to happen. And he describes the hour of his passion and crucifixion in terms of the hour of childbirth, of a woman in travail, of a woman who is seized by contractions, the pains of childbirth, and that this is a sorrowful and distressing time, but only for a short time, because once her child is delivered, her joy returns to her. And Jesus is saying that the disciples will have this kind of experience, right? In the very near future, they will experience the pain and distress of Jesus being arrested, abused, and then put to death unjustly and in such an agonizing way. But that pain will only last for a short time because they will then see him again. Jesus is hinting, in other words, at his resurrection after his crucifixion. And so they finally kind of, the pieces snap together for the disciples and they understand, now we understand what you're saying. Now, Jesus goes on from here to say what is, I think, the most important verse in today's reading, and that's really the final verse, which is verse 33, where Jesus says, I have said all of this to you, that in me you may have peace. Now, what does it mean to say that they will have peace? He just said they will be like a woman in the distress of labor, right? Seized by the pangs of, contractions of having a child, which of course a man can only understand analogously because, for obvious reasons. But why would Jesus say that they will have peace when in fact he just said they're about to pass through a dark alley of his passion in their own way? Well, Jesus is not saying that peace is something that he imparts to them in the forewarning, in the knowledge itself. What he says is that in me you have peace. Right? He's talking about something different than just I'm setting you on your guard. I'm letting you know what's going to happen beforehand so you don't need to be too troubled by it when it happens because you know that I've already foreseen this. That's not what he's talking about. It's in me you will have peace, Jesus says. And this is a uniquely Christian thing. It's the peace that comes with being united to Jesus Christ. And it is a peace that, put it this way, it's not just the absence of conflict or the absence of anguish or the absence of pain or suffering in any particular form. It's something other than that. So Jesus is not saying that the disciples will be given a carefree life of ease. Life is not a rose bed. He's not just going to pave the way smooth before them. No, there are difficulties, real difficulties coming down the road. The peace that Jesus is speaking about is a relational peace. It's our peace with God. All right, St. Paul has this famous line in the book of Romans that having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. When the barrier of sin is removed and we are reunited and reconciled to the Father, that's where true peace lies. And it's not in any way dependent upon our outward circumstances. All right, it's a peace that can be securely possessed even in the midst of chaos, even in the midst of the travesty of Christ's crucifixion, his rejection, his abuse by the elders and the religious leaders of Jerusalem, right? All of this is something, none of this, we could say, can actually disturb the kind of peace that Jesus is talking about. I just want to turn just briefly to the book of Philippians because St. Paul seems to speak about this and understand this peace in a very unique way. Paul says to the early Christians in Philippi, this is in Philippians chapter 4, he says, "Have no anxiety about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Then the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will keep your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." The peace of God is something utterly different than the peace of the world, because the peace of God surpasses understanding. We can't even wrap our minds around it. How is it possible to live at peace in the midst of a world that is ravaged by sin, in the midst of a world that is hostile to the Christian faith? Well, if that peace is the peace of God, the peace that comes from God, and the peace that unites us with Him and reconciles with Him, that kind of peace, Jesus says, is the kind of peace that cannot be disturbed. Now, the latter part of John 16, verse 33, Jesus goes on to say, "In the world you have tribulations, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." Now, I have to admit that I'm using the RSV translation, and the RSV translation is a really good translation of the Bible. It's one of the best, in my personal opinion. However, there is something less than satisfactory about the RSV's translation of this final sentence. "In the world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer. What do you think about when you say be of good cheer? It sounds like Jesus is saying, keep your chin up, keep your head up, all right? Don't be sad, don't be downcast. Rejoice because you know that there will be victory in the end. That's not really what Jesus is saying. All right, in the original text of the gospel, the verb here is tharseo. And the verb tharseo means to be courageous. It means to be strong. It means to stand firm in the midst of opposition, in the face of danger, in the face of persecution. All right? In a modern colloquial way, it might be equivalent to saying, man up. All right? Overcome your fear. Not overcome sadness or despondency, but overcome fear. Be courageous. And why should they be courageous? Because Jesus has overcome the world. All right? He's already achieving a victory through what he is suffering and what he's about to suffer at this point in the story. All right? He's already achieving a victory, and so that should give us the confidence, inspire within us the confidence to be of good courage, not just good cheer, but courage, right, to overcome our fear. All right? In fact, the reason why, if you look at this whole discourse as a unit, you will see that the reason why we can be courageous in the face of danger is because God dwells within us. All right? Jesus speaks of the entire Trinity indwelling his disciples, his followers who believe in him. In fact, that reminds me of a statement that John himself, the evangelist, made in his first letter in the New Testament. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 4, he says, "He who is in you is greater than he who is in the world." So you might have heard the expression that God plus one is a majority, right? Because if God is indwelling you, then whatever the world throws at you will not overcome you, because God has already overcome it in Jesus Christ. So what is today's gospel really telling us? Well, Jesus is not promising his disciples a life of smooth sailing. He's not promising his disciples a life that has no storms, no turbulence, and no rough roads ahead. No, he's actually saying that does lie ahead. But he is promising them, if not that kind of peace, the kind of peace that the world gives them. He is promising them the peace of God. And that peace of God comes because we, as Christians, share in Christ's victory. He's promising us a share in his conquest over the world, the flesh, and the devil, right? And that's the kind of thing that can inspire us to be not of good cheer, but to be courageous in the face of all that the world throws at us. I pray that this reflection was of some benefit to you. I pray that God blesses you and your family in your day, and I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Thanks.